keep eating, keep enjoying. We have a fabulous speaker for you here. At least he was here. Yep, there he is. Our next session is going to be with the ever-present Senator Mark Warner, a leader of many things in this town these days. In particular, he's going to be talking about his thoughts and his long-standing work on the future of capitalism. He'll be led in that conversation by our friend Steve Clemons, as well as Rebecca Rosen, who's the senior business editor over at The Atlantic. So let me invite Steve, Senator Warner, and Rebecca on stage. Big round of applause.
Are we on? There we go.
We're on.
Hey, wasn't that a great line? You guys all did lunch in 18 minutes. That was really, really awesome, so thank you. Senator, we've been spending the morning talking about a lot of dimensions of what a healthy economy, its components, its stakeholders could look like, everything from tax reform to getting investment. We're trying to kind of cover the gamut. You have been out there quite a bit, a businessman longer than you've been a senator, and said that right now capitalism is in danger. It's unsustainable in its current form. And I'd love to understand more of what you see are the tectonic dimensions of that argument that you've been making.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's one, it's great to be here. And two, it's really great to talk about something other than Russia. Until tomorrow morning at least. But stay tuned, it's going to be a wild week, I can promise you on that. 2 years ago, I started this journey, and frankly, absolutely anticipated that I'd be spending all of my time on this topic. As Steve mentioned, my background is a venture capitalist. I was in the tech field, managed to eke out a living in cell phones. But it struck me that a lot of our political debate, I mean, I know this is going to be a newsflash, but a lot of our political debate right now is all backwards looking. You know, on one level, you've got, through Mr. Trump, this idealized view of could we take America back to a glorified time of the 50s and 60s, when maybe for white guys there was a fair economy, but for the rest of America, it wasn't necessarily that fair. And candidly, on a lot of folks on the Democratic side are almost looking back to a wistful notion of a 30s top-down, government-driven redistribution system. And frankly, neither one of those, I think, are going to meet.
Is that the Bernie Sanders model?
Your words, not mine. But are going to meet where the workforce is headed. And as somebody, my background was I managed to do pretty well as an entrepreneur, failed a few times, but then hit into cell phones. But I worry as a capitalist that modern American capitalism is not working for enough people. I worry that something has fundamentally changed when short-term, quarterly driven profits are often obtained at the destruction of long-term value creation. And that the fundamental nature of work in terms of the traditional setup of the 20th century where people went to work for the same company. My dad worked for the same company for 38 years, never made a lot of money, but had economic security with that. And that we set up back in the 1930s and 1940s a really good social insurance system, a social contract that worked for almost 100 years. But that is now fundamentally changing. So in a very quick top line, a third of the workforce in America today is already in contingent work. They're not working full-time, steady job. They are part-time, they're 1099ers, they're independent contractors, they're this sexy hot area of gig workers, which is still relatively small but growing dramatically. That third of the workforce is going to 50% of the workforce by 2025. And we can either try to spend our time arguing and relitigating labor classification rules of the 20th century, or we can say, how do we meet the workforce where we are? Why shouldn't we experiment with portable benefits? How do we think about a system that would allow a person to move from job to job and carry benefits as they move from job to job? Now, who ought to manage those benefits? That's a jump ball. It could be government. It could be a 21st century union. It could be a fintech company. It could be new levels of associations. But we ought to be experimenting in that area in a way that's pretty dramatic. Let me hit out two other quick comments and then
Becca's going to go
then
at
Becca
you.
can fire. So that's point number one that we're investigating. Second is, if you accept the premise that people aren't going to work for the same job forever and that there is this remarkable short-termism that is trumping in our business cycle right now, there really is no rational economic reason for any business to invest in upskilling, not getting a first job, but upskilling low and moderate income workers. Because by definition, low and moderate income workers are the ones that are going to be most vulnerable to globalization, technology, and that's even before we even start talking about the scary world of AI. And I got to say, as a former governor and senator, I think many government training programs are well-intentioned, but from an ROI standpoint, they don't have a great track record. We spend a lot more than what we get in terms of output. I believe, frankly, that business does a much better job of training up, particularly training up for jobs that actually exist in the economy right now, better oftentimes than government. So could we rethink, in a way, workforce training, not that first job, but that continuing upskilling, because nobody's going to enter the workforce with adequate skills to spend 20 years. And maybe even think about changing the way we treat workforce upskilling from a tax deduction to a tax credit, pay it out over multiple years, and really think about how successful the R&D tax credit has been around intellectual capital, and could we offer that same kind of approach in terms of human capital, but targeted, and I say this respectfully to all of you in the room, not at an Apple engineer who's making a couple $100,000, but for people below a certain income cut line, say $70,000. Final point, and then we'll get to questions, is I started businesses, was an entrepreneur, started Nextel, was a venture capitalist, but the capitalism I grew up with in the 80s and early 90s has radically shifted. The average hold on a public stock has gone from 8 years to 4 months. Back in the 90s, 50% of corporate profits were reinvested in business. Now 95% are spent on share buybacks and dividends. Most public CEOs I talk to say they don't have owners anymore, they've got renters. And without us devolving into some way that we simply reinforce stagnant management teams, there's got to be something between the kind of stultified Japanese economy analogy and the go-goism now that says the first thing we cut is R&D, plant and equipment, or particular training. So could we and should we look at differential capital gains rates? Certain European countries are looking at additional voting power for shares that are held for longer period of times. Are there ways to separate the way particularly pension fund managers are paid, not on quarterly basis, but towards long-term value creation? And there's a series of other things that could grow out of that, where we could create metrics for responsible businesses that wouldn't be government run. I had somebody the other day, the folks at Ernst & Young said, the amount of value that's captured on a balance sheet right now is only about 30 or 40% of the company's actual value. Because it doesn't capture intellectual capital, it doesn't capture HR, it doesn't capture all of the intangibles that are actually measurement of whether a business is going to be a success, yet the only way we, for the most part, value that business is actually on quarterly based returns. So I'd love to have that debate. Go ahead.
So can I just push you on this question of the workplace training programs? A lot of programs have been shown to be not that effective. People don't end up with better jobs. What can make these programs successful, really promote people into better earnings, better security, in light of that short-termism that you're talking about, which kind of has shortcut some of the career paths for people?
And as somebody who still remains pro-trade, one of the biggest mistakes, I think, as a pro-trade advocate is we, writ large, those who supported trade, we did a crummy job helping communities and individuals that were dislocated by trade. So I think about Southern Virginia, where we lost textile jobs and furniture jobs in mass numbers in the 90s. We gave people TAA voucher certificates. And unfortunately, we had a disproportionate amount of women who got displaced, particularly in textiles. So we trained tons of hairdressers in Southside Virginia. We didn't need tons of hairdressers. The truth is, a business is going to be better equipped at knowing what the job might be. And I point out Randall Stevenson, what he's doing at AT&T, is probably the best example in this space in terms of offering virtually anybody who works on the line a chance to get some level of a degree from Georgia Tech. And I don't think it all need to be degree driven. But I would argue that if the business knows where the job opportunity would be. The business is reluctant sometimes to invest in that human capital because in a society where people move jobs as quickly as they do, why train that person up if she or he is going to move on? So if you say, we will give you the business, we're going to help, in effect, almost subsidize you by converting the dollars you spend above a baseline from a deduction to a credit, pay it out over multiple years, and even if the person, if she moves to another job, as long as she receives an industry-recognized certification that results in a higher skill and higher pay, I don't mind even still saying if we have to slough off a little bit and every dollar may not be totally efficiently spent, if you've got that upskilling taking place. And where, for everyone who says, well, that sounds wild, Warner, but in Washington it's never going to happen, we might have an opportunity to try this in a massive experiment. I, for one, believe in corporate tax reform. I believe in repatriation. But the notion that we're going to allow some of America's most successful companies to bring back those dollars at a much reduced rate, and maybe for the only ask being that some of those dollars coming back can be invested in infrastructure, I think is a much too low of ask. Why couldn't we put as part of any repatriation deal a requirement that every company that repatriates, and if I could really spread a little bit more, even down to their supply chain, has to put a meaningful training program in place in upskilling for people below an income cut line.
So connect repatriation to retraining.
I think there is a chance, and I think here is
interesting.
a place where there could be enormous common cause with the president. The president talks a lot about helping disenfranchised workers, and communities have been left behind. We've not seen actions that demonstrate that other than the idea that he's going to somehow pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, and that's going to turn on a lot of jobs around the country. I don't agree with that at all. But the idea that if the president wanted to say, all right, for companies that are repatriating, if we move towards a territorial system, part of the price of bringing back those dollars would be putting in place meaningful training programs and upskilling. I call it more upskilling than training for people below an income cut line, and maybe even a little extra incentive to locate some of those supply chain jobs in communities that have been left behind. I think there would be great alliance with the
Let me ask you, so Randall Stevenson, for those of you who know, is CEO of AT&T. He happens to be in town today in Washington, D.C. today, and I've been trying to, one of his staff right here, I've been trying to lure him over and surprise all of you, but I don't think it's going to happen. But if he were here,
if I give up part of the Russia stuff,
I would ask, I'd ask Randall about his training programs. AT&T invests a huge amount in upskilling its incumbent workforce and doing it. It has something called the Nano Degree, working with Sebastian Thrun and Udacity to create for just anyone, may have had a tough time in their life, to create a basic coding capacity and digital skills capacity that they can come in and come into this. Now, the government wasn't involved in that. This was something that it's AT&T's initiative, AT&T driven. What I'm interested in this question between short-term and long-term behaviors is how much of it are you trying to be a cheerleader to get businesses to behave differently on their own? How much of it requires actual government meddling or government framing?
I think you need the moral voice of trying to encourage businesses to have a level of social responsibility. And there is a movement taking place. If you look at pension fund investment and the whole movement around ESG.
Could Donald Trump be that moral voice?
Let me finish my answer first. All right. And then you also have a series of these consumer movements, the B Corp movement, the inclusive capitalism movement, the conscientious capitalism movement, Paul Tudor Jones, Just Capital, Mike Bloomberg, SASB. I love all these things. I don't know whether we have the luxury of taking a decade to get responsible business behavior-driven metrics the way it took us a year to get LEED certification in the energy space. So I would like to goose that. And maybe it might be through the foundation world, not government. Government ought to not set these metrics. But a $100 million X Prize to say to all you groups, go spend 12 or 18 months, figure this out, and let's see how the market reacts. Because one of the things I believe that, and privately run companies actually do a better job because they still have closer connection. I think for a long time, the moral fabric that held business and workers closer aligned was when the management and workers lived in the same community. You didn't want to go to church or synagogue or the club and be viewed as the jerk. So there was some moral suasion that took place at the community level. When you disaggregate workers from their management teams, that connection has gotten frayed. And I don't want to say that this upskilling program is going to solve everything. It may simply buy us 5 or 10 years so that smarter people can figure out when the actual next wave of AI comes and everything is dismissed. But if people in this room don't realize the anger that has created movements on the left and the right and legitimate frustration, and think that we have the luxury of puttering around and simply relitigating the old issues, which quite honestly, the old issues, everybody's got an established position. But if we come at portable benefits or upskilling or trying to get the capital markets to look at a longer term business cycle rather than shorter term, I don't know if those are Republican or Democratic ideas.
This idea that business leaders used to once be in the same communities as the people they employed is also illustrating another big dynamic in the economy right now, which is kind of this bifurcation geographically of areas of real growth and areas of decline. How would an upskilling program serve areas where there just aren't jobs for people to go into once they?
Well, one of the hopes that I would have, whether through job owning, through tax incentive, or other programmatic incentive, is we have, I've heard from every business leader who wants to do repatriation. We got 2.7 trillion abroad, we're going to bring this back, we're going to invest in America. Although at record low interest rates, they could have been doing that investment anyway right now. And what we don't want, and I say this as somebody who favors lower rates and a competitive tax structure, we don't want to repeat of 2004 when we did that tax holiday and all these dollars were spent on share buyback and dividends. So the notion that and this won't be perfect, there will be seepage, but the ability to try a major experiment with all of these companies and say, we'll bring it back and we can debate the rate and we can debate the use of funds. But you need to put in place a workforce training program for folks below X income. And we might even give you an extra point lower on that repatriation rate if you would locate jobs, and this is, I know, some of the stuff that EIG has been working on, in those communities that have been left behind. I mean, the promise of the information age was you could build it anywhere. And we've shown you can build it in Mumbai and Shanghai. We've done a crappy job of showing you can build it in rural America. But the disadvantages of rural America, maybe not for the highest tech, but for mid-tech jobs, with our energy costs lower, with communications costs lower, with rising labor costs abroad, rural America is much more competitive than it was a decade ago. My best day as governor was when I were able to bring from a tech company that did a lot of work with Virginia, 700 mid-tech jobs to a little town called Lebanon, Virginia, in far southwest Virginia. It has been remarkably successful. These are, $60,000 to $100,000 jobs for the most part. They may not be the most successful here in Fairfax County, but in southwest Virginia, these are great jobs. And they've found the talent. They haven't had as much competition. Why we've not seen that model duplicated 100+ times is something that policymakers, and frankly, if you want to be a responsible business leader, you ought to be part of. And if we do repatriation, there ought to be some incentive or prerequisite that some of those, at least those supply chain jobs, end up in those communities.
Mark, one of the, I think it was about 2004, I wrote a pair of articles with Robert Gates, who was then president of Texas A&M University, and we'd of course been after 9/11. His worry was that the smart folks around the world who were used to come to the United States, get into U.S. universities, come and build companies in the United States, be part of the entrepreneurship and innovation. Basically, that America was the brain drain problem for the rest of the world, was coming unplugged, and we needed to worry about that. Now we go far, far ahead, and we have a president who's sort of creating, if not a real wall, a feeling of a wall. And if you look at university enrollments in Canada, in the UK, in France, but mainly, partly the English-speaking Commonwealth countries and whatnot, surging in terms of people who might otherwise have come here. That's also a part of our story of capitalism. Are you worried at all?
Absolutely. I take, in my state, in Virginia, in the Commonwealth, our hottest tech area is Northern Virginia. A third of all the company founders are first-generation Americans. I mean, America's secret sauce was always the ability to bring in the world's best talent, and if you adhered to our principles and values, you became an American first generation. I mean, I could move to Egypt tomorrow and live there for the rest of my life. I'd never be Egyptian. I could move to France tomorrow, and even if I could learn to speak the French well, I would never be French. I mean, America is the only place. Now, my Canadian friends and British friends will say they actually are taking that mantle. And the unfortunate thing, Steve, is because they reform their immigration policies, even those folks who come to America, get those graduate degrees, come out with those ideas, they don't have to go home. They just have to move across the border or move to the UK, move to Australia. So immigration reform obviously has to be a piece of this. And the president's comments, whether it is on mysterious travel bans that he asked for 90 days, he's had a lot more than 90 days if he wanted to change the processes for some of those countries. Or
you don't need a travel ban if he'd fix the vetting while he had the time to do it, right?
Right, he's had the time to do it. Or the outrageous tweets he made about the London mayor and the aftermath of the tragedy in the UK. This is enormously destructive to how people outside the world view our country, but also people who are students here, and for that matter, obviously Muslim Americans who are saying, are they welcome? So I think the notion here is our system, and whether we call it capitalism, free enterprise, however, and smarter people than I can figure out the terminology, I think it's worth saving and fighting for. But it's not going to be fought for by the same old tired arguments that we're rehashing for the 15th time on health care, existing tax reform, other policies where everybody's established as a Democrat and Republican. If we can't break out of left-right and red-blue and more future-past, America's been its best when it's always future-leaning, regardless of party. Any country, Ronald Reagan was good about this. Ronald Reagan was great about having an America being a future-leaning leader of the world. We've got to get back to that, but part of that will require a new way to address some of these economic challenges. When we've got a third of the workforce going to 50% that has no social insurance, that is a recipe for disaster, because no matter how well you may be doing, you hit a bump in the road and you have nothing underneath you, all you then fall back upon are already strained government relief programs. If we don't acknowledge that people are going to change jobs on a regular basis, and if we don't have an ability, no matter how good you come into that first job, if you're low and moderate income or low and moderate skill, if you don't have a path upwards, you're the first person on the chopping block. And if we can't make a capitalism that actually works for a little longer term, I often get when some of my friends in the finance world say, "Oh, Mark, this is just the market readjusting itself. Look at Jeff Bezos. He's never made much money, but the value of the stock goes up like mad." Well, that's because Bezos controls the vast majority of the stock. Why Zuckerberg does, why Google does. You have different governing structures for some of our most successful companies who are not subject to the short-term pressure. I'm not saying every corporate raider is bad and every movement. There's got to be some in-between here that simply gets us back, frankly, to a capitalism time horizon that actually worked pretty darn well in the 80s and 90s.
Beck, did you have a 10-second question and a 1-minute response, Mark?
Well, this is not a 10-second question. What is the way of aligning those shareholder interests and the interests of the broader public?
Well, I think there are a couple ways. One, and this is where I don't think government should do it, but if we could create the equivalency of LEED certification for businesses in terms of how they treat their employees, I would count actually, particularly on pension fund and long-term investors, to reward that. And what gives me a lot of hope is folks like you, millennials, even if our kids aren't that political, they want to work for and buy from companies that bear some social responsibility. I believe the market will move that. But we don't have the metrics right now, and honestly, we have all of our tax and other incentives pushing companies the opposite direction.
Well, I know, Senator, that you have Mike Rogers and Dan Coates tomorrow in a hearing, an Intel committee hearing, and you have Jim Comey on Thursday, and I hope you talk to them about what it takes to build a longer-term sustainable capitalism in this country.
After a few other questions, but thank you for letting me come here, and I know I've overstayed my weight.
Thank you very much. Senator Mark Warner.
Last point, though, I really appreciate what Steve, you guys are doing, and everybody here. I know for most of us, you want to throw a shoe at the TV at this point when things come on. I feel the same way, and I'm inside the TV. But we live in the greatest country in the world. None of that has changed. And there's no problem that we can't overcome. I think our country will come through this challenge around Russia in one way or the other stronger, because the whole set of problems we face were much bigger than just what Trump and his affiliates did or didn't do. But if we don't come back to these issues about how we sort through getting the economy right so that people believe in our system, then it is as grave a threat as anything the Russians tried to do in intervening in our elections. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for being here. Thank you.